Thank you all for tuning in from wherever you are in the world. I'm Ollie Rankin, and I'm here today to talk about how you and I, all of us collectively, can build the future that our children and our planet deserve. A future that is diverse and inclusive, fair and sustainable. I've lived most of the last decade in Vancouver, BC, and one of the things I miss about attending events in Vancouver is that they almost always begin with an acknowledgement that the attendees are gathered on the unceded traditional territories of the First Nations tribes who were there long before Europeans arrived. It's very important that we don't take for granted how much of our success is dependent on things that don't rightfully belong to us or on the efforts of others. Now, I currently live in Los Angeles, so let me start out by acknowledging the Tongva, the Native American tribe who've lived in this region for thousands of years, who resisted colonization by Spanish missionaries, and who continue to fight for federal recognition. I also want to acknowledge the millions of people brought to the New World against their will, from Africa and elsewhere, whose slave labor tamed the land and laid the foundations for the modern prosperity we all enjoy. I want to acknowledge the present day workers who are so essential to the basic functioning of contemporary society that we insist on them continuing to work during this pandemic, even though it puts their lives and the lives of their families at risk. I want to thank them for continuing to do this vital work, even though they aren't being paid commensurate with the risk they're taking, nor the value that they contribute to all of our lives. Ultimately, I want to acknowledge that the person I am and the things I've achieved are not mine alone to take credit for. Across billions of years, from the Big Bang to my parents banging, there were a gajillion random events that had to string together exactly as they did for me to even be born. Then, I just happened to be born with boy junk to white parents in a first world country, which, let's face it, is like winning some kind of cosmic lottery. Sure, my parents were poor and they got divorced when I was young, but compared to many of the other kids in my school, I was blessed. And compared to kids in the third world, I was born in the lap of luxury with advantages and opportunities they can't even dream of. At every stage of my life, I've been the beneficiary of outrageous good fortune. Let me give you just one example. In the late 90s, I earned a degree in the then obscure field of artificial intelligence. Yes, I was into AI before it was cool, but it took an amazing stroke of serendipity, meeting someone on an electronic music emailing list, that turned my AI degree into a golden ticket to work for Peter Jackson, building brains for armies of orcs and elves, choreographing epic battle scenes in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They say you make your own luck, but that's actually a very entitled perspective. I used to believe it because it made me feel good about myself. It allowed me to completely own my successes by taking credit for things that, frankly, I have very little ability to control. But if you apply that same logic to the unlucky, then you're suggesting that they bring misfortune upon themselves. And when you think deeper about that, it's a particularly cruel kind of victim blaming that gives cover to racist and classist ideas about who's allowed to be successful and who isn't. Everyone who succeeds at anything does so through a combination of skill, effort, support, and luck. So I don't feel like it diminishes my accomplishments in any way to recognize that they wouldn't have been possible without an enormous amount of good luck. Nor does it diminish my accomplishments to acknowledge that they wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of hundreds of people who've helped me directly and millions who've helped me indirectly along the way. What it does do when I recognize that is that it diminishes my sense of entitlement. What it does do is remind me to be grateful every single day for my good fortune. And that, in turn, makes me focus on what I can do from my privileged position to help others who are just as smart and who work just as hard, but who haven't been as lucky or as supported. So on that note, I also want to acknowledge that there are thousands of people out there who are just as deserving as me of the opportunity to be here today speaking before this audience, but who haven't had and maybe won't get that chance because of bad luck or because of biases in our culture. And I want to do more than just acknowledge all of these things. I want to change them. I have confidence that collectively we're capable of so much better. We're not doomed to return to the pre-pandemic status quo of exploitation, entitlement, and inequality. I believe this COVID-19 disruption is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to steer our culture away from bias and entitlement and towards inclusivity and fairness. Business as usual has been interrupted in unprecedented and fundamental ways. The train has gone completely off the rails, and the effort of lifting all of the carriages onto the right track is only about the same as putting them back on the wrong one. Do you remember November? According to the calendar, it was only 7 months ago, but it sure feels more like 7 years. Anyway, back in November, I was at VR Days in Amsterdam to speak and to show off an interactive VR film I made called Downloaded. While there, I had lunch with Michelle Riac, one of the curators of Venice VR. We were meeting because we shared an ambition to virtualize virtual reality conferences and festivals. I know, fancy that. At the time, we thought it was an urgent necessity for two reasons. First and foremost, to reduce our personal and professional carbon footprint. You do remember that our planet is in the midst of a climate crisis, right? And we both felt incredible guilt at the amount of air travel that was involved in attending events around the world several times a year. So we were determined to champion a more environmentally conscious alternative. Secondly, we wanted to address the issue of access. Too many people are unable to attend conferences and festivals physically because of the time, the travel, and the expense involved, or because their physical and mental capabilities aren't adequately catered for. So we thought the option to attend virtually would open these events up to many more people, and in so doing, would hopefully help to address the prevailing lack of diversity. Now, I don't know if Anne-Marie and team have stats on the demographics of this event compared to last year's, but I'd really love to know if the audience today is more diverse as a result of this increased accessibility. Anyway, fast forward a few months, of course, and the novel coronavirus had overtaken our fledgling initiative. Suddenly, virtualizing events had become the number one priority of all event organizers across all industries. Now, I'd like to do a quick shout out to everyone in the Embrace Online XR and Zero event groups on WhatsApp who've been working together en masse to crack this giant nut. In part, thanks to your efforts, here we are at a virtual reality conference. Understandably, we're hearing a lot over the course of this event about the different solutions that people have come up with to solve the immediate problems of gathering, networking, and collaborating in the time of COVID-19. But what about the climate crisis and inclusivity? Until we solve those things, you could argue that anything else we're doing is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Now, it might not be obvious to everyone that inclusivity is a similar level of crisis as climate change and ecosystem collapse. So allow me to explain why I think that's the case. The ecological emergency we find ourselves in is the result of unchecked exploitation of the Earth's resources and disregard for the consequences of waste disposal. As a species, we've taken more from the planet than it can sustain losing, and in turn, we've polluted it beyond its capacity to absorb. Why? Well, it's certainly not out of necessity. It's the result of certain cultural tendencies that are so ingrained in most of us that we think of them as inevitable human characteristics. But the individualism from whence our greed and selfishness derive is not an inherently human trait. It only arises in societies that are built predominantly around competition. Societies that are instead built around cooperation don't display these same traits at all. Many indigenous and Eastern cultures don't even have a concept of fairness because sharing is just their default behavior. But in the West, and especially in the United States, we do live in a culture of individualism and tribalism that perpetuates the denigration and oppression of everyone who isn't rich, white, male, and straight. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen a number of disgusting examples of how the dehumanization of African Americans leads to persecution and unjustified killing. Yes, the current political climate is partly to blame, but the current political climate is a manifestation of individualism and tribalism, not the other way around. The way I see it, promoting diversity and inclusion isn't just a band-aid to treat the symptoms of systemic unfairness. It's actually a way to combat the conscious and unconscious biases that individualism and tribalism depend on to survive. When we stop thinking of people who are different from us as others and instead think of them as equals, then we stop thinking of anything that benefits them as being taken from us. We start to realize instead that what benefits them also benefits us, and more importantly, we start to recognize that anything that harms them also harms us. Case in point, at all times, but most acutely during a pandemic, it benefits all Americans for all Americans to have health care. The fact that many don't puts the health of all Americans in jeopardy. That same logic applies to things like climate change, pollution, deforestation, and loss of biodiversity. The impacts of these are predominantly affecting minorities as well as poor and marginalized communities. So we urgently need rich white folk to care about the well-being of poor brown folk if we're to have any chance of working together to save the world. I'm sure you're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's an elegant way of stratifying the things humans need, ranking them in order from those that are most fundamental to our existence at the bottom to the most personal and ephemeral at the top. But another way to look at this pyramid is as a mirror held up to our social class system, with millions of poor people at the bottom struggling to feed and clothe their families, while only the wealthiest and most privileged at the top can afford to indulge in mindfulness and self-actualization. The measure of a society shouldn't be how successful and self-actualized its elites are. Instead, we should measure a society by how healthy and happy its poor are. Those of us who have made it to higher tiers have a duty to help elevate our brothers and sisters lower down in the pyramid. I'm not saying we shouldn't be building apps for mindfulness, but I absolutely do feel that in order to earn the right to pursue these frankly more indulgent needs, we must pay our dues by shoring up the more fundamental ones for our fellow humans. Or, as my nana would say, you can't have your dessert until you've finished your vegetables. Climate change and inclusivity are issues that destabilize the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. So let's get to work. I'm on the VRARA's VR for Good committee, and there's a lot of great initiatives underway in our industry already. I know the people at Unity, HTC, and Oculus who lead those companies' internal programs to foster the creation of tech and content that benefits all of humanity and the planet. And I'd like to commend those companies, but I'm here to ask them and every company to do more, to commit time, money, and resources in proportion to the scale of the problems that we face. In fact, I'd like to issue a challenge to all of you. Here are 4 common sense principles that I consciously use to evaluate every decision and action I consider taking. 1. Be honest and transparent. 2. Surround yourself with people who are different from you. 3. Only take as much as you need. And 4. Do no harm. Make it your personal and company mission to improve the world around you in everything you do. And please, don't create products or work for clients whose purpose is exploiting the planet, people, or other living things. Now, it's too early to tell where we are in the lifespan of this pandemic. A couple of countries have managed to nip it in the bud by taking strong, coordinated action, including my own homeland of New Zealand. So, ka pai Jacinda, kia kaha Aotearoa. For most of the world, I'm sorry to say, this pandemic is only just getting started. However, there are already a lot of important things that COVID-19 has proven. For instance, nurses, teachers, and grocery store clerks are more essential to the functioning society than hedge fund managers and political lobbyists. Industrial farming isn't as robust as we've been told. Parks and beaches are better than malls and movie theaters. We don't really need as many clothes or as many showers as we thought we did. The list goes on. To me, though, the most important takeaway from this pandemic, from watching how different communities and organizations have responded, is that good decisions require good information. Only by knowing who has and who has had the virus, only by knowing who's been in contact with infectious individuals and who has immunity to it, can we hope to contain its spread. Only by rigorously following scientific protocols to develop and test potential treatments and vaccines can we hope to eliminate it, or at least to mitigate its impact. Unfortunately, on top of our climate and viral pandemic crises, we're also in the midst of an information crisis. We're bombarded with more information than we can absorb, and unfortunately, much of it is intended to mislead or otherwise influence us. The ease with which images, audio, and video can be edited to change their meaning, and the speed at which media can be published and disseminated, makes it incredibly difficult for even the most astute people to stay abreast of objective reality. As cheap and frivolous entertainment content has proliferated, news media has struggled to compete, or in order to compete, has compromised its integrity. Confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance have trapped us in these polarized news bubbles in which people are exposed to vastly different alternate versions of reality depending on their preferred news sources. So, right at this critical moment in history, when the truth is more important than ever, it's also harder than ever for us to agree upon. And our industry's unspoken goal is to fake reality in ways that are completely indistinguishable. So it's especially important that we take a lead in tackling these issues. Like many of you, I grew up on science fiction, and I was particularly drawn to cyberpunk authors like Bruce Sterling and William Gibson. Even before home PCs were a thing, before the internet or smartphones, I was already ready to migrate to the metaverse. Teenage me would have expected us all to be implanted with neural interfaces and bionic enhancements by now. That future is certainly taking a little longer to materialize than I anticipated. Now, I reread Neuromancer recently. It's still an amazing piece of literature, but it was the afterword by Jack Womack that's been stuck in my head ever since. In the midst of an essay about the undeniable significance of the book, he reflects upon how accurately Gibson was able to predict our present-day cyber reality way back in 1987. But rather than portraying Gibson as uncannily prescient, Womack suggests that he was simply influential. As Womack puts it, what if the act of writing it down, in fact, brought it about? Womack is suggesting that the sprawl novels served as a blueprint that researchers and technologists like ourselves have obediently, if unconsciously, implemented. I bet that rings true for many of you. It sure does for me. And George Orwell must be really turning in his grave about now. But ironically, the authoritarian populists who are following George Orwell's playbook of misinformation and control were voted into power around the world on a platform of fixing the broken status quo. Of course, they had no intention of fixing anything, they just wanted to take their turn at the trough. But if Johnson, Bolsonaro, and Trump have taught us anything, it's that pointing out problems and blaming others for them is much easier than actually coming up with solutions. Similarly, a lot of science fiction tends towards dystopian. It's much easier and frankly more entertaining to extrapolate the negative trends in our society and to imagine how bad things could possibly get. It's hard to propose a solution and even harder to follow through and implement one. But if we built the present based on dystopian fictions from the past, who is writing the utopian blueprint for the future that our children will build? I say it should be us. Now, one of the most important things that Barack Obama ever said has been largely obscured to history, drowned out by the backlash because, unfortunately, it was also one of the least articulate things he ever said. The soundbite that was taken out of context was, if you've got a business, you didn't build that. But the point he was making is that we all benefit from the infrastructure of modern society, and we mustn't take that for granted. None of the disruptive things that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, or Mark Zuckerberg have done would be possible without roads, the postal service, electric grids, and the internet. That infrastructure was built through massive collective effort, and the costs were shared by all of us, whether through taxes or fees. But the true cost of things is hidden, because we don't account for the damage done to the planet to extract the resources, or the fact that most of those resources aren't renewable, and neither do we account for pollution and emissions. When a company's value proposition is just to find loopholes that allow them to avoid paying their fair share of the costs incurred by society or by the planet, that's not an innovation. That's piracy. That's why I've never been a big fan of Uber. Their business model is to exploit the working poor as drivers, avoid paying road user charges, and to drive existing operators and competitors out of business. That's just plain and simple predatory capitalism, and we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. So what about us? Why am I giving a talk that doesn't really have much to do with VR or AR at the VR AR Global Summit Online? There are a number of things that set us apart from the rest of the startup community and from the business world overall. Forgive me for generalizing, but we are an industry of self-selected pioneers and dreamers who've mostly chosen to forego getting rich quick to instead work in a challenging and progressive industry that we're passionate about. We are a new industry that doesn't yet have an established elite nor a legacy of systemic bias. That means that we can and we should model inclusivity in the teams we assemble and the products and services we offer, by making diversity the prime directive of our hiring strategies, and by designing everything we make with everyone in mind. We can show other industries the way forward. We are also an open, supportive, collaborative community that understands that a rising tide lifts all boats. So we are uniquely positioned to demonstrate the benefits of business models and intellectual property policies that are rooted in cooperation rather than competition and protectionism. We are also the one industry in the whole world that is best positioned to work, collaborate, and gather remotely. We can demonstrate how to massively reduce the number of miles driven and flown without a loss of productivity. But we shouldn't be constrained to thinking of this as a solution to COVID-19, because it also allows us to address climate change, diversity, and accessibility. We can use our expertise to ensure that our industry and all the industries we service are inclusive and sustainable. And finally, we hold the keys to a medium of immersive, intimate, evocative, transformative storytelling. It is both our privilege and our duty to create content and to tell stories that inspire people with the possibility of a future that is equally accessible to all, that is intentionally, radically fair, and indefinitely sustainable. In short, to build a future for everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk. If you're interested in sharing ideas or working together to help realize this vision, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or Facebook, and I'm available now to answer your questions if you have any. Thanks again.